Welcome back. Now, the last time he was with us, he had just won many new admirers after facing down his interrogators in the US Senate committee. It was memorable for all the right reasons. Since then, of course, there was that infamous episode on Celebrity Big Brother, which was probably memorable for all the wrong reasons. However, this week he's probably very pleased with himself with Tony Blair's swan song at the Labour Party conference. Will you welcome, please, George Galloway. Hello, George. You're very welcome back.
Nice to see you again.
Let's talk about that first. Were you pleased that Tony's finally shuffling off the Labour Party stage?
Well, I thought it was deranged. I mean, as a piece of work, his conference speech was magnificent. But if you look at it on the page, it's absolutely bonkers. So,
but it's all
Britain's
in the delivery.
Better off without him.
It's all in the delivery.
Yeah, it's the way he tells them. You know, he did a lot of damage to not only Britain and the world, but to the Labour Party. He's thrown away two big majorities.
You must be pleased then that Gordon Brown, to the left of the party, is coming in to take his place.
Well,
perhaps?
I'm the author. Are we past the watershed?
We are. Yeah. What time? Yeah, we are.
I'm the author of the phrase that Blair and Brown are two cheeks of the same arse, and I'm afraid you're going to discover that there's no difference at all. A bit like Irish politics, where they're all different cheeks of the same arse.
You are familiar with our political system, are you?
Well, yeah, I'm following the travails of your Prime Minister.
You've met him?
I have. In fact, I've sat at Celtic Park with him more than once. I quite like him as a person, I must tell you. And
Did you have a whip around in the stand?
I'm a bit sorry. No, we didn't have a whip around for him. If I'd known he needed it, I might have organised it. But no, I quite like Bertie, and I'm sorry that this has happened to him. But the real problem is that the political parties, at least the mainstream political parties, are different cheeks of the same arse.
Yeah, you did, though, talk to Bertie about your concerns, didn't you, about Iraq and all of that? Well,
it's just funny you should say that, because actually I ranted and raved at him about the use of Shannon airport for the war, and Ireland's position on its neutrality was being compromised, and so on and so on. And he agreed with every word I said. And yeah, he was the Prime Minister that was implementing the policy, and someone told me later, it didn't matter what you said, Bertie agrees with everybody.
And then does what he wants to do anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
The Tony Blair thing, though, did you ever have a sort of a one-to-one conversation with him about, you know, where you thought he was going wrong?
Well, you know, he said on television recently that he was surprised by how things had turned out in Iraq. But he had no right to be surprised, because I told him man to man, just me and him, outside the gentleman's lavatory in the library corridor of the House of Commons. I told him everything that would happen in Iraq if he did it. And everything that I said turned out to be right. But the disturbing thing is that it didn't seem to matter to him how dramatically I painted what the post-war situation would be. I said it will not be the beginning of the end when Baghdad falls, just the end of the beginning. The Iraqis will fight you with their teeth if necessary, for as long as necessary. There'll be car bombs, suicide bombs, extremists will come.
You said all of this?
I said they'll be coming from all over the world like bees to a honeypot. I was actually more graphic than that, but I'll not
But Jack Straw said today, as you know, that you know, he blamed the Americans. He said if they'd listened to Colin Powell, because Colin Powell, in the first exercise in Kuwait, he made sure that they had such overwhelming force that no matter what happened afterwards, they were in a position to police the aftermath. They didn't listen to Colin Powell. And now Jack Straw said they should have. They were wrong. It's dire, and it's the Americans' fault.
Well, isn't it funny that the only person who apologised at the Labour conference last week was John Prescott, and that was for fiddling with his secretary's drawers. The men like Straw and Blair, who caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the destabilisation of the whole world, scarring the face of the international legal and political system, bringing the UN into disrepute and the rest, they're still sitting as bold as brass.
But
and none of them
I mean, the way you're talking, you think that they were war criminals.
Oh, they are. For me, Blair should leave Downing Street not in tears like Mrs. Thatcher, but in handcuffs. In fact, I think him and Bush should be incarcerated for the rest of their natural, preferably in a cell together at The Hague. Though I must say, putting putting Mr. Blair in a cell with George Bush for the rest of his life would probably constitute torture.
I think, though, you probably have to concede that George Bush believes what he's doing.
Well, you know,
in other words, he doesn't see himself as a sinner. He sees himself doing perhaps God's work.
In fact, I think that's absolutely right. George Bush told us that he hears voices. He actually told an Israeli newspaper that God told him to attack Afghanistan. God told him. No wonder he speaks in tongues. He's hearing voices. Like every serial killer in history, he's hearing voices that are telling him what to do. Now, God save us from messianic political leaders who think that God is directly talking to them and telling them what to do. But we've had the bad luck to have two messianic leaders at the same time in Washington and London, and that's why the world's such a dangerous place.
But what Tony Blair said the other day at the conference, he said, look, you know, half-hearted support of the United States, they don't understand. Sometimes you make difficult decisions. I made a decision to support the Americans. Perhaps I was wrong, but the one thing the British people will not forgive you for is for not making a decision.
Well, he made a decision which was so catastrophically wrong that he should end up on trial for it. I mean, it's not a small matter. It's not like getting the rate of interest wrong, or the level of income tax wrong, or the route of a motorway wrong. We're talking about the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the fanning of flames of hatred and radicalization across the entire world.
Yeah, but hang
We're
on.
talking about war throughout the world.
If they had done it right, if it hadn't been this doctrine of minimum force or minimum forces, the Rumsfeld doctrine, if they put massive forces in there, they could have policed it afterwards and done it right.
As Shakespeare
and
put
Saddam
it,
would have been gone.
treason never prospers, for if it prospers, none dare call it treason. It's true, we wouldn't be having this discussion if their criminal war had gone well. But what do you say about a policy that turns out not just to be a crime, but to be a blunder? Something which is a crime and a blunder, which has achieved the opposite of the effect that it was supposed to, which has made thousands of new bin Ladens, in fact tens of thousands of new bin Ladens. You've got 1.5 billion Muslims out there boiling with anger at us, made the whole world a much more dangerous place, left your own country not trusting a word you say. I mean, the reason Blair is going, because nobody believes him any longer, just the Egypts in the bubble at the Labour Party conference. The rest of the country no longer believes the word he's saying.
Is in the audience, the editor McGill. You would take issue with George?
I would. I just think it'd be wonderful to have as simple a view of the world as George has. I mean, if these men are evil men and are war criminals, what does that mean that Saddam Hussein is? This is a man who invaded two neighbouring countries, a force for instability for 10 to 15 years, massacred hundreds of thousands of civilians, not deaths which happened through matters of war or airstrikes. You know, Blair didn't willingly go out and decide, I think I'll gas the Kurds, I think I'll gas the people of Birmingham, or I'll kill hundreds of thousands of Shiite Muslims in the south, as Saddam did. This is a man who George used to go over and cosy up to and thought he could find reasonable. Perhaps that was the two cheeks of the same arse there that you were kissing at the time. And you've made a career of it. I admire your principles and I know you're motivated and so on, but I think your view is utterly wrong-headed. And the fluency with which you deliver it, I think, is really damaging, because it means that throughout the world, where we have people like Saddam or Hitler or Mugabe or the situation in Myanmar, we can't intervene because you'll come along and say immediately that those democratic countries doing so, with or without a UN mandate, are war criminals.
Where'd you get that, Egypt?
He's the editor McGill. He's a respected journalist in this town.
Charge then, George? Is making a career out of it?
I don't even know who you are, so you're not anybody to charge me.
I'm not a celebrity.
It does matter. No,
I'm
it
not a
does
celebrity
matter.
like you are.
It does matter. It does matter. Now that I know you're the editor of McGill, it's absolutely shocking that an editor is so ignorant and ill-informed about these great issues. First of all, he's got all his numbers wrong. We've killed far more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein ever did. Secondly, I'm dealing with Saddam Hussein. When Britain and America were arming Saddam Hussein, I was outside his embassy demonstrating for human rights and for justice in Iraq and being denounced by the British and American governments and the big newspapers for causing trouble, because Saddam was a bosom buddy of Britain and America. You want to talk about gassing the Kurds? Who sold them the gas? It wasn't me.
That's 83. That's 83.
You want to start the clock when you want to start it.
Well, you could go back and back forever. Like they armed Iraq to match Iran. Move to 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait.
No, why do you want to start the story at... No, you want to start the story at 1990.
Well, we go to 1945.
Well, no, go to 1945. Go to 1988.
Tell us about
1988, just 2 years before the date you want to start on. The bombing of the Kurds in Halabja was done with weapons given to Saddam by Britain and America and West Germany.
Now, it was done by Saddam.
Yes, but he was able to do it because of weapons that we gave him, because of the immoral principle that was in vogue at the time, that my enemy's enemy is my friend. The very principle which brought us Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was equally armed and supported by Britain and America, because we thought that you could have a tiger by the tail. We now know differently.
Guns and weapons are sold throughout the world.
The Western
they end up in the wrong hands.
It didn't end up in the wrong hands. They ended up in the hands they were intended to.
What was your solution?
Bin Laden.
Against sanctions. You're against sanctions.
Bin
what was
Laden,
your solution?
Bin Laden, I'm speaking through the chair because that's what I'm used to doing.
Yeah.
We're going to have a harangue. I wasn't expecting this, but you're welcome
you're
to have a
stairhead.
You're welcome to have a stairhead brawl with me
this is
if
not
you like. I'll go.
I mean, you two are never going to agree, that's for sure.
Well, I don't know who he is, so I don't know if we're ever going to agree. You'll forgive me.
Can I ask you another question, George? Did you say that the assassination of Tony Blair could be morally justified?
I said if you were an Iraqi whose home had been destroyed, whose country had been broken into 1,000 pieces, whose sons were in Abu Ghraib prison being tortured, whose house had been demolished, whose job had been disappeared and privatized, and whose street was occupied by foreign soldiers, I've no doubt you could make a good moral case for the assassination of Tony Blair.
If you found out of a plot that would do for Tony Blair, what would you do about it?
I would tell him. I would tell him.
You would save his life?
I would tell him, and I'd say, do you remember that conversation we had outside the gentleman's lavatory? You should have listened to me. And hundreds of thousands of people that are dead now would still be alive. The world would not be destabilized. And the only man in Ireland, the editor of McGill, would be the only man in the country who thinks you and Bush did a good job. And I think that if I got that chance to speak to Tony Blair, to warn him of that plot, it would be for this reason, that the assassination of Blair would merely strengthen the hand of people like him who want to go around the world invading other people's countries, setting up regimes that are more to their liking, because they see the world as a kind of white man's burden that somebody, God perhaps, gave us a job of setting to rights in our own image. I find that attitude disgusting, and most disgusting in Ireland, a country that was occupied by colonialism for hundreds of years. And you've got people justifying colonialism now calling themselves editors of radical magazines.
Would you have tackled Franco or Hitler, no?
I would have been in the front line against Hitler. I would have been in the front line against Hitler.
There's intervention for a
country. No, that's not intervention. Hitler was the most powerful dictator in mainland Europe, with a powerful industrialized state, an army of millions of people, who was on the march occupying other people's countries.
Can I move on?
We are the equivalent of Hitler.
If you see instability,
no, it's not a small tyrant.
Human rights
a small tyrant.
A duty to intervene.
A small tyrant opposed to a big tyrant. Why do you concentrate on the small tyrant? Bush and Blair have killed more people than Saddam Hussein ever dreamt of. American imperialism and British imperialism before it killed more people than Saddam ever dreamt of killing.
That may be, if you like, the collateral damage of the incompetence of their invasion.
No, it isn't. You keep saying it's incompetence. My problem is not with their incompetence, but with the idea that powerful countries have the right to occupy smaller, weaker countries. I refused it in all of my familial life, going back to my great-grandfather, who left this country because he was an armed opponent of British occupation of Ireland. I'm certainly not going to support British occupation of Iraq when I oppose the British occupation of Ireland.
Moving on to someone else, a dictator, Fidel Castro, and you have
Who writes this stuff?
He is a dictator.
In what sense is he a dictator?
Well, in the sense that he is not democratically elected. I mean, there is only one
George
Fidel.
Bush.
Well, I mean, we could argue all day about George. The point is, Fidel has been there since the revolution which overthrew Batista, and he will be there to the day he dies.
He overthrew a brutal American-backed dictator who was put in power by the United States to keep Cuba as a bordello, as a casino for the mafia and for the criminal classes of the United States of America. You should thank him for that. You should be grateful to him for that. You should be grateful for the fact that he's turned Cuba into a beacon which is shining a path throughout the poor world, what we call the third world, which has left him, after 40 years, the most popular political leader in the entire world. I'll tell you this, Fidel Castro never asked anyone to pass the hat around to raise money. Fidel Castro doesn't own a single dollar. He doesn't own any more than the uniform on his back. He's been 40 years in power and doesn't have a bank account. Fidel Castro is the greatest leader of the third world that has been produced in the 20th century. So don't call him a dictator.
No, but he doesn't give his people a choice, does he? I mean,
Well,
you get
the
Fidel
people,
or nobody.
Well, that's
Perhaps
the people,
Raul, his brother.
That's the people that have a longer life expectancy than they do in the democratic United States, whose children have lower rates of infant mortality than they do in the democratic United States, whose children go to kindergarten, school, university, postgraduate entirely free, whereas in the United States only the children of the rich or those prepared to get into debt are able to go to university. Cuba is regarded by poor countries as an absolute model, and it's done it all despite more than 40 years of terrorism from the United States, destabilization, invasion, assassination plots. Fidel has seen off 10 US presidents who together have mounted hundreds of assassination attempts. And yet, despite all that destabilization, just 90 miles away from his beloved United States, he has built something really precious. I call it in the book a sprig of white heather in the future's
How does he feel, though, about on the territory of Cuba, the presence of Guantanamo Bay?
Well, they're outraged by it. The United States refuses to leave Guantanamo Bay. It illegally occupies a part of Cuba, which is bad enough, and then it creates a human rights monstrosity where hundreds of people are incarcerated in cages in the tropics, drugs forcibly administered into them, tortured, many of them committing suicide, in a legal black hole that's a scar on the face of the world, in somebody else's country. And it's in Cuba because they'd never get away with it in the United States.
Do you ever feel like a lonely voice in the wilderness?
On the contrary, most people watching this agree with me. They don't agree with him or implicitly with you.
I'm just doing my job, George. One last thing, that people, the most memorable image of you they have is from Celebrity Big Brother, okay? You remember it, the cat.
I was a tiger rather than a cat.
All right.
I'd rather be a cat than a poodle of George W. Bush.
Do you have any regrets about doing that?
No, not at all. I walked out of the Big Brother house and was immediately given a national radio show on TalkSport Radio every Saturday and Sunday night. I've got thousands of listeners in Ireland, by the way. Yeah. And I'm speaking to 3 million people in Britain every Saturday night and every Sunday night for 2 hours at a time, and I'm about to go to 3 nights. That came directly out of the Big Brother house. But most importantly, I raised a record amount of money for Palestinians in Gaza who are starving to death because they're under siege for having the temerity, hey, of voting in a democratic election, but for the wrong party. That's the democracy that people like him support.
All right, George, is there ever any way back for you into the British Labour Party? Is that...
No, I think the Labour Party has been hijacked and flown to destruction.
But you've only, I mean, in terms of the big parties, I mean, the Lib Dems, are they yet another cheek?
I'm afraid so. If an arse can have three cheeks.
So where is there for people like you to go?
Well, we've got our own party. It's the fastest growing party in Britain. We have more than 20 councillors. We're the official opposition in 2 of London's main boroughs. We are the first party for more than 60 years to win a seat in the British Parliament to the left of Labour. And we are the party of the anti-war movement. Young people, in particular, support us because we're the anti-racist party and we're the anti-war party. And every decent person is against racism and against war. So I think we've got a big future.
George Galloway, thank you very much. They were in a position to police the aftermath.